All righty. Welcome, everyone. We are so glad to have you here for the second time Sarah and I have done this self-care webinar. We are going to have some activities today that are pretty low-key, so we're going to do something incredibly drastic, so we're hoping that you all are going to enjoy today.
My car's being pulled all over. If
you can make sure that you are muted, that would be great because we are recording today. All right, Sarah, I want to make sure you see the right screen. Do you see the presentation?
I am, yes.
Perfect, good. All righty. So welcome. My name is Angie Rehling. My pronouns are they, them, and I am a prevention coordinator with WCASA.
Hello, everyone. My name is Sarah Curley. My pronouns are she, her, and I am also a prevention coordinator with WCASA.
And today we are going to
They have two prevention coordinators. Oh.
We are going to be talking about self-care today and how to take care of yourself. So reminders, we are recording today, so if you would like to remain off camera or change your name, please feel free to do that. We are going to be asking for some involvement for y'all today. So please use the chat. If you would like to take yourself off mute, you're more than welcome to do that. Also, take care of yourself. This is a self-care webinar, so if you need to get up and stretch, get a drink, please feel free to do that as well. So what do we call this? What do we call these feelings that our body is telling us that we need to take care of ourselves? And a lot of these may look so similar. You might have heard of vicarious trauma, which is the cumulative effect on us who are working in helping professions, who are working with people who have had a traumatic event in their life. Compassion fatigue, the feeling of I just can't give anymore for another person. Again, you might be experiencing that because you are working with folks who have experienced a traumatic event. Overwhelm. This is just, again, the cumulative effect of just those feelings of I am feeling incredibly overwhelmed by everything in my life. So not just work. This could be just life, world events, just in general. Also, maybe what is happening within your personal life. That you feel that it's just way too much for me to handle or manage. And then the feelings of burnout. I think those are the more serious feelings of where everything that you feel joy from, or not everything, but the majority of the things that you're feeling joy from, you don't feel joy from them anymore. So those things that you normally like to do in your lives, they feel like a job, they feel like work. So these are just the defining terms of some emotions that you might be feeling. So we want to talk about how the stress can manifest in our lives, in our body, in our mood, and in our behavior. And these indicators of stress can be seen as warning signs from our body that something is going on and that intervention is needed. So a survey completed by the American Psychological Association, Stress in America 2020, found that 80% of US adults say the pandemic is a significant source of stress in their life, and that 60% said the number of issues that America faces is overwhelming. And that was in 2020. And we have had even more significant life events, world events happen since then. So I'm kind of wondering what that survey would tell us now. So when we see these things manifest in our body, in our mood, in our behavior, so headaches, Again, those feelings of being overwhelmed, increased use of alcohol or other drugs, increased use of tobacco, social withdrawal, sleep problems, gastrointestinal upset. These are signs that we are experiencing increased level of stress. So the body releases a stress hormone, which is cortisol and adrenaline, being the most well known. And then this prepares the body for fight or flight. So our evolutionary response to a threat. And stress isn't inherently like a bad thing. It is a way for our bodies to communicate with us, letting us know that there's something wrong and that we need to address it. So it becomes harmful when the stress is chronic, as it can cause an increase in inflammation in the body, which can lead to negative health outcomes. So this is kind of like what we talked about in the previous slide, just that cycle of stress. Now, it's a very simplified version because I'm not a scientist. There's so much science involved in this that I don't understand, so I've kind of made it simplified so that we can see what that cycle of stress looks like. So in a typical stressful event, our bodies release hormones. And with that hormones shows up the symptoms of stress, so that going back to a couple slides previously, so those interruptions in our behavior, in our mood, in our bodies. And self-care is that thing that can help us interrupt that cycle of stress, which then brings our body back into homeostasis. So the normal, regular levels of hormones in our body. So what happens when we can't break the cycle? So this is the same cycle. So what happens when we can't break that cycle? So when something comes in that prevents us from doing self-care, or we just don't have the strength to do self-care, we just don't have the time to do self-care. If we can't interrupt that cycle of stress, our bodies then remain in that elevated hormone state, where the hormones can then cause damage to our bodies by showing up as trauma responses. So our bodies are not meant to exist in that constant state of stress. There's research showing how stress can change our DNA, how stress can cause structural changes to our brain, impacting our memory and how we think. Stress can reduce our immune response, making us susceptible to disease. And just that increased hyperarousal state puts us in it's just draining to our bodies, right? So as we mentioned, our bodies are not meant to sustain that level of hyper-awareness. We may not have, thinking about what causes the stress, we may not have a lot of control on what is stressing us or where the trauma responses are coming from. But we have to think about where we might have control. So we can try to mitigate the impact of stress on our bodies by incorporating self-care into our daily routines and lives.
It really isn't uncommon for people in our field, in our profession, to think that maybe if we don't talk about the stress that we are experiencing in work or in our personal lives, that we will be able to avoid it. Or maybe we feel that by admitting that we're feeling burnt out, or that fatigue, or that trauma exposure, by even acknowledging it or admitting it, we are somehow naming or revealing a failure in ourselves, almost as if the presumption is that to be in this field, I will always be able to handle what I hear, what I see, what I'm doing in the day-to-day to serve survivors, to serve my community. And the truth is that's just not realistic or fair to ourselves as helpers, right? It's okay to realize that the trauma that we are being exposed to through this work does impact us. That doesn't make us less effective in our positions, in our roles. The truth is that, right, this avoidance or this lack of acknowledgement is really common among all people, not necessarily just people in this particular field. But it's really all the more crucial that helpers, such as all of you, are able to pause and to take recognition of this. It's okay, it's necessary. We can't do our jobs effectively if we aren't able to recognize our own needs and our own burnout and our own fatigue. So we just want to name that this can be hard to even acknowledge. And you're muted.
I was muted. Thinking back to how stress manifests in our bodies, here's just a different example of how that can show up. Some of these responses may resonate with you, and some of them you may read and be like, I never thought that that could be a symptom of stress that I'm experiencing. So this comes from a book called Trauma Stewardship. And there's a lot of great resources from that book. And this is one of them. And in the book says, as you care for people with your heart wide open, you don't often realize how much of what you're exposed to is being taken in and held in your body. So these are the examples of how our body reacts to that vicarious trauma, that secondary trauma that we are taking in ourselves because we're compassionate people. We took this job because we want to help people, right? And so these feelings of lack of presence, deliberate avoidance, cognitive overload, inability to see options and diminished creativity, lack of awe, which I never really thought of as being like a symptom of stress, but I think it can go along with just that feeling of apathy, where I just can't feel anything anymore.
So next, we're going to take a few minutes to share together what are the signs in ourselves that we are feeling burnt out. And to do this, we're going to be using an application called Padlet. So I will show you all how to use this program. So first, I'm going to share my screen. Okay, and then let me make that full screen. Can everyone say, Angie, can you see that okay? Okay. Fantastic. So I'm going to put this link in the chat. And if you click on that link, it should bring you to a screen that looks like this. And I'm going to ask that we only go one question at a time here. And the first question that we're asking everyone is, what signs do you recognize in yourself that indicate you are feeling burnt out? And so as soon as you've gained access to this page, what you can do is come to this column here, and you can go ahead and click the little addition sign underneath the question. And then, sorry, folks. There we go. Someone already did it for me, hypervigilance. So you can add a post to the section by adding the plus sign there and then typing in what are the signs that you feel. You can also take a photo from your computer. You can upload something, or you can enter a link if you want. So there are different ways to interact with this in addition to just text if you want. But this is just a great way for us to organize and collectively see what are people feeling and how do they know that they themselves are starting to feel that stress and that fatigue. So I'm going to stop sharing. Angie, if you don't mind pulling it back up. Sorry, with my one screen, I was trying to keep tabs on everything there.
All right, screen.
Okay, and so then I'll go ahead and put that in again. We'll take another minute to answer, and then we'll take some time to go over those responses and see what is coming up for people. Are you able to share the Padlet screen, Angie?
Probably.
Thank you.
You seeing the right thing?
I'm seeing the PowerPoint. Are you able to do share?
Click on the Padlet, the thing.
If not, I can try taking that over again.
Let's try again. Did it work?
Yes, thank you.
I think it's because I had the PowerPoint on the other side.
Got it. Okay. So thank you all for taking some time to enter your answers here. We've got a lot, I would say, just right off the bat, which is great. So signs that you all recognize in yourselves. Hypervigilance can often indicate that you're feeling burnt out, right? Anxiety, avoidance, and resentment. I know that that resonates with me. Lack of engagement with others, feeling tired, a lot of exhaustion, high startle response. Super not happy that you experienced that, but really applaud your awareness of that, because I know that that's an easier one to sort of get swept under the rug. Feeling imposter syndrome, lots of tension, edgy, overwhelmed, taking my work home. Those boundaries start to disappear, right? Wanting to quit my job. I think we can definitely say that we have all been there. Overeating, crabbiness, lack of concentration, looking for another job, right? Looking for a different way to spend our time and spend our day. Sunday scaries. Oh, I relate to that really hard. Yes. Ready to fight or argue, feeling like I can never relax, eye twitching. Wow. Okay, so while none of these, right, are things that I would ever wish on anyone, what I really want to do is acknowledge the vulnerability that you have all shown in naming these things, because it can be difficult, like I said, to practice that awareness when we are having these signs of this stress and this trauma response, let alone naming it. That's challenging in and of itself. So thank you so much for sharing and for being open about what it looks like in yourself when you're starting to feel that trauma and that stress weighing down on you. And as we acknowledged, as Angie spoke to earlier, there's plenty going on in the world without our daily jobs and our work to cause enough stress as it is. We have so much going on that toss in a career which chronically exposes us to secondary trauma, and that burnout, that compassion fatigue becomes tenfold. And so I saw that some of you got excited and started adding your answers to the other two questions. I will ask that we hold off on jumping into those, because we're going to take some time to reflect on those questions as we continue to go through this. So no worries if you've already added your answer, but if you haven't, please go ahead and hold off. Rest assured, we will get to those questions later on in this presentation. So thank you all for sharing that. I think it's, if anything, not only powerful, like I said, to name those things, but hopefully reassuring to each other that we are not the only ones who are feeling this and who are experiencing this. Thank you so much for sharing. So jumping back into our workshop here, here's something that I wish I could shout from the rooftops, right, for everyone who's in this field, especially if you yourself are an advocate. I would not be surprised if you have found yourself giving this insight to survivors that you are working with, but have you ever stopped to think of it for yourself, right? And that is, you don't have to set yourself on fire to keep others warm. Speaking from my own personal experience, I have held both roles in my life. I have been an advocate and a crisis responder, and I have been a prevention educator. And something that my bosses had to regularly remind me in both roles is that I didn't have to bend myself in half, right? Set myself on fire for the betterment of others. So I have no doubt that all of you today are in this profession because of how much you care, right? We would not be advocates, we would not be prevention educators if we did not have our heart and soul in this work. Because I mean, it's a dark joke, but we all know that we're not here, right, for those paychecks, right? We're here because we care. But that doesn't mean that we have to endure chronic exhaustion and trauma to be a part of this work. So while we know that we can't do this without passion, we have to acknowledge that it comes with its own set of challenges as well. If we are ignoring the signs that we may be burnt out or even experiencing vicarious trauma, it's not just us who is suffering and getting hurt. It's similar to when you're on an airplane and the flight attendant at the beginning of the flight reminds you that if an oxygen mask comes down, you have to put your own mask on before you help the neighbor in the seat next to you. That really applies to us in this field as well. We cannot show up for the survivors that we're working with or the communities that we are educating if we ourselves are running out of our own oxygen. The best way we can help others is by helping ourselves. If we don't ensure that our own supply of oxygen is going right, we won't be around to make sure that others are getting the support that they need. So survivors, community members do not benefit from sacrificing our own well-being. We have to make sure that our own oxygen mask is on, is secure, that we are getting the air that we need. So whatever your metaphor of choice might be, what we're really imploring is that we be mindful of the fact that neglecting ourselves doesn't just harm us, right? It harms the people that we're serving as well. So I might not be alone in this observation, but there's something about our field and the field of helpers in general, in which it's really difficult to just say, I need help. And we want to take some time to examine why is that the case? Why is it so hard for people in our line of work to acknowledge that help is needed or that they're feeling that burnout, that they're feeling that fatigue? The first reason why it might be the obvious one, right? In our fields as helpers, there's a lot of pressure to be available and accessible in every conceivable way. So if something triggering occurs, we're supposed to be the strong ones that are helping the survivors, that are helping our community. Did one of our coworkers have a harder situation? Is your spouse going through something tough, right? We may start to downplay our own experience and the validity of our feelings and our stress because of the pressure, the implied pressure to be strong and to be the one that can be relied upon, that can be the helper. That really can feed this false voice in our head that is telling us, well, we can't ask for help because it shows weakness, right? Our role is to be the helper, so we are not allowed to have these feelings of exhaustion, to have these feelings of stress. That's not our place. We don't get to do that. We don't get that luxury. The second reason that might show up for you or for others that you know in similar work is something that I personally have seen and experienced myself in different places, in different agencies, I should say, in this line of work. And that is a sort of unspoken competition of self-sacrifice. And what I mean by that is that it might sound something like this, right? So on the slide we see, oh, can you go back, Ange? Thank you. So that unnamed competition that I was speaking of, that might sound like this. I only got 3 hours of sleep last night. And then another coworker shares, well, I worked for 12 hours straight. I had 7 crisis line calls, right? And still had time for my 8 scheduled appointments, right? I have started to have nightmares from the secondary trauma that I'm experiencing, but you don't see me complaining. We start to participate in this competition of like, who is the most burnt out, who has the biggest load, and who can be the most burnt out at the end of the day. And frankly, it's not a competition I want to be a part of, but it is oftentimes an unspoken pressure in our field of work of who can sort of run themselves out the hardest. I can't even really say with definitive confidence of what that proves, but it does seem to sometimes be a dynamic in our places of work. This implication that you care more, you're the better worker, you're the better team member, if you are the one who is the most exhausted. And I want to like cop to the fact that I participated in this, right? That I don't want anyone to feel guilty if they recognize themselves in this dynamic, because it seems to come from this place of hiding the very real stress that we're feeling, right? It's sort of like a defense mechanism. So I don't want anyone to feel guilty or shame for recognizing themselves in this, but when we pause to recognize that this unnamed competition of who can be the most burnt out is actually a defense mechanism against our stress and against our fatigue, hopefully we can practice some some self-compassion. She talks about this in trauma stewardship. Yes, Jess, we're definitely going to be mentioning that resource at length here shortly. So thank you for naming that. So I point this out just to name that there might be different things contributing to our fear for acknowledging that we're tired and we need help, right? That could just be the pressure on ourselves to be the strong ones, or this defense mechanism of, well, being burnt out is a badge that indicates my dedication to this work. And we know that you're dedicated to this work. We know that you wouldn't be here if you weren't, right? But it's important to take a closer examination at why is it so tough for us to ask for help in the first place? So something similar that felt related in my mind is this idea of good vibes only, right? And maybe you have come across this in online spaces or amongst your friends, but it's this idea that if you just put on a brave face, you'll be fine and we'll get through the hard stuff that's happening at work, that's happening in our personal lives. We just have to make the choice to be brave and to be okay and to be positive. The problem is that good vibes only is an example of what is sometimes called toxic positivity. It ignores the reality that as humans, we experience discomfort, we experience sadness, we experience and have the need to experience loss, to experience fatigue, right? By saying good vibes only, we are completely dismissing the necessary parts of ourselves that require compassion and care. We can't brave face our way through trauma exposure, right? It has to be named, it has to be acknowledged. And so when we force ourselves to take this attitude of good vibes only, we are completely erasing an essential part of who we are and how we show up in this work, right? We can't good vibes only our way through trauma. We deserve to be acknowledged as whole humans when we show up in this work. By adopting an attitude of, I'm just going to choose to be positive, you are doing yourself a disservice. So what does toxic positivity look like or sound like? Here are some examples, right? So toxic positivity might be this idea that being negative isn't going to help me. I have to choose to be positive. Good vibes only, right? I'll get over this. I'm going to smile instead of cry. I'm just going to stay positive. What if instead of dismissing our feelings or avoiding discomfort, we just let ourselves and others feel it? In our roles as advocates or prevention educators, we are holding space for others to acknowledge trauma. Why is it that we can offer that readily for others, but we can't do it for ourselves, right? We are just as deserving of the same compassion and the same acknowledgement. And so I want to encourage us all to think about, what if instead of pushing this to the side, I gave myself space and room to feel it? So how can we show up for our friends, our families, our neighbors, and the people that we care about if we avoid our own realities and our own needs, our own compassion needs, right? How can we show up for ourselves? Because when we're able to do that, we're able to be there all the better for the people that we're serving. This is just a quote that I really love, that I think is a good reminder on those really difficult days. Let everything happen to you, beauty and terror, no feeling is final, which feels like a great response to the good vibes only temptation, right? It's such a good reminder that to be human is to have all the emotions, all the experiences, all the feelings, and I'm not going to pretend that I don't. I'm not going to pretend that I don't need help. I'm going to let everything happen to me, because that's what it is to be human. That's what it is to be in this work. So we're going to go back to that Padlet tool that we had just used previously, and we're going to stop and reflect on whether or not it's difficult for us to ask for help. So is it hard for you in your role or even personally to ask for help? Is it hard for you to acknowledge that you're struggling? And why do you think that is? And so I will again go ahead and share that link in the chat. If you've already answered, that's okay. You can answer again if you feel like you have more to share. And we'll take 2 minutes to let people respond, and then we'll take a few minutes to discuss together. Yes, Jess, see you've got your hand up.
Yeah, I just wanted to comment how great it was that you said you had a supervisor who kind of reflected to you that like you're taking on a lot, you need to take a break. Like that's really amazing. I saw Dr. Laura Vandernoot Lipsky speak, the author of Trauma Stewardship. And one of the takeaways that I had from that was like not oppressing ourselves, and then like having supervisors who also like don't let you oppress yourself, which was
Yes.
so huge, because I feel like so many people like that high productivity can be a trauma response as well too, like where you feel like you have to be perfect and go 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 go, and which can be great, like you're producing a lot and you're doing really well and that looks great from like a supervisory role. But to also realize like people need to like go at a sustainable pace and take care of themselves, and to see that in leadership is so important. And I just wanted to point that out.
Thank you so much for naming that, Jess. I could not agree more. That is something that we will also name a little bit later in this presentation, but you did such a great job of highlighting the value of that workplace culture that we are seeing, not just amongst our peers, but also amongst our leadership, that like acknowledges that there are humans who are in this workspace. And the productivity pressure, right, is not just a symptom of this particular field, it's a symptom in pretty much every conceivable field ever, right? Because that is capitalism. And I'm going to avoid getting on that soapbox, but my point being that when we have leadership that acknowledges our needs as people who are doing this incredibly tough and traumatizing work, that means honoring the sustainability that is necessary, right, to do this and to show up repeatedly, to resist the pressure and the temptation to go, go, go and be perfect, and to be putting out product after product, whether that's lots of notes, lots of groups, right? Whatever that looks like in your particular role, when we have leaders who aren't afraid to interrupt that cycle and to honor us as people first, who happen to be doing the job, right? Not just workers, we're able to set that tone and to create that culture. Yeah. Angie, I don't know if you had anything you want to share there too.
Oh, I think having supervisors who recognize that, you know, the world is literally on fire, and that is impacting us personally, but also professionally, because we are working with people who have experienced a significant trauma that might be re-triggered by the trauma that is existing in the world now. Trauma is funny like that. So when we are supported by the people who are supervising us, that can literally mean the world. I know it has meant the world to me personally, being involved in an organization that sees the people that are working there as humans, that have feelings, that are fallible, that are impacted and affected by everything around them. I am 42 years old, and I'm ashamed to say that this is one of the first times that I've ever really felt that. So it's incredibly important if there, and we'll talk about this, you don't want to jump too far ahead, but if there are any supervisors on the call today on this webinar, it's incredibly important that we see that the workplace culture is being incredibly impactful to everyone involved.
Yeah, thank you, Angie. Are you able to share the Padlet?
Yes.
Thank you so much.
Hopefully it works this time.
Okay, no worries if not.
Did it work?
It did, thank you. So looking at question number 2, no, it's okay.
2 years into this.
Looking at question 2, is it hard for you to ask for help? Is it hard for you to acknowledge that you're struggling? Why? People had a lot of thoughts. So lots of us admitting that we, as the helpers, don't feel like it's our place to ask for help, or that it's difficult to acknowledge when we need help, right? Lack of empathy and understanding from the supervisor. And I wish that wasn't such a common thing that we hear and that we know that people experience, but that is unfortunately sometimes a reality in this line of work, and in lots of lines of work, right, where it's hard to ask for help because of that pressure coming from the leadership to be productive and to be on top of things. person saying yes because I feel by asking for help, they might think that I'm lazy or that I don't want to work. I have a good network of support. I'm grateful for them. Oh, I'm so glad that you do. I'm really, really glad there's someone here that feels like they can ask for help and they've got a good network. It is incredibly hard to ask for help. I want to feel like I can handle it and take on the job and all its feelings, but in reality, I need to break some time to help from others. Yes, we are only human and that is okay. Yes, difficult to ask for help, especially since my default when stressed is withdrawing from others. Excellent self-awareness. Super glad that you are aware of that, but I can definitely see how that creates that complication then all the more. A couple people saying that they know their limits and that they know how to ask for help. That is amazing. And I am proud of you and please teach the rest of us. That is really, really great. And that is such a valuable skill to have. I feel like I'm expected to always be up and on, that I can't have a bad day. Okay. Yes. So definitely seeing a lot of patterns here, right? One person sharing my job title keeps me from asking for help because it feels vulnerable to admit that I'm not okay. If it's this hard for me, though, I can only imagine how my patients feel when they share that they are truly, how they are truly doing when they reach out for help. It gives me a reality check with how incredible humans are. Oh gosh, I learn every day from my patients and I'm so thankful for that. That is a really beautiful lesson to take away from this. That, like we said, we are all humans who are just doing our best. And sometimes there are outside structures that pressure us to feel or perform a certain way, but that doesn't erase the fact that we're humans and that we are showing up in this work with stress, with outside things that we carry into the field itself, right? Like you don't show up in a vacuum. You are carrying everything that happened the day before and the day before that and the things that morning. So again, hopefully the takeaway from this is that you are not alone if you feel like it's hard for you to ask for help. And we are hoping that as we continue through this workshop, we can sort of troubleshoot through those challenges and find ways to make it easier for us to ask for help.
We talked at length what those trauma responses look like within ourselves. So now we're going to shift to what do we do now that we've recognized that something is going on. So here are things that we can do to address it. Emergency self-care. Sometimes in the moment, it's really hard to get that extra oomph within ourselves to be like, oh crap, like I'm super stressed. Now I need to like go find a book or find somebody's number or just find something to make me happy. So Sarah and I, and probably some folks on this call, are preventionists. We like to stop things before they happen. And being proactive in our self-care is one way to do that. So making it a priority and planning ahead is a great way of doing that. And here are some examples on the screen right now. Make a list of things that you enjoy. It's easier to remember what we like to do and what we find joy in when we aren't already incredibly overwhelmed in that moment. List some things that you can say to yourself. Self-talk is incredibly important. I feel like we focus so much on negative self-talk than we do positive self-talk. So reminding in that moment that we are worth the joy, we are worth taking that extra few minutes of a really crappy day to take care of ourselves. List the people with their phone numbers who you can connect with in that moment. Also, list things that you should avoid, whether that is food or words or people. Just list those things that you want to stay away from in that moment. And it may sound silly, but put it on a card and keep it somewhere for you that is handy. You can also make a toolkit, which is super fun. In this field, we are uber aware of all the toolkits in the world that are out there. So make it fun. Do it as a thing that you do with people around you together. So fill it with things that you can use in an emergency. Things that you can smell, touch, taste, hear, etc. That is really important when we are overwhelmed with anxiety to ground ourselves. And then include a copy of that list. in that toolkit for you. Another thing that we can do to practice self-care is boundary setting. I myself am really horrible at this, and I feel like a lot of people are. But understanding and setting boundaries is a very important part of self-care that we might not like readily think of as being self-care. So setting boundaries can help us define and determine our self-worth and show others that we are worth prioritizing and protecting our mental health and wellness. Boundaries also show other people you know that you are worthy of respect from other people. It also benefits the people that are around you. And it's just goes to show that boundaries are incredibly important for everyone. It strengthens relationships. Things run more smoothly when expectations are clear and others feel respected when you communicate your needs and expectations. And we all know that when we take care of ourselves, we are happier and we are healthier. So everyone benefits when we have more energy and patience and when we are less reactive to things that are around us. Setting boundaries, this is the hard part. Recognizing that we need boundaries, yeah, that's cool and fun and great and all, but actually setting them is the hard part. Boundaries are personal, so you might have different boundaries than other people in your workplace, in your families, and in your friend groups. So try not to compare your boundaries to anyone else. Sometimes it's easier to workshop with other people, but just know that where your limits are might be very different than the people that you are around. And with that same kind of sentiment, don't judge someone else for how they have defined their boundaries. It's a skill. Setting boundaries is a skill. It is a really hard skill. So start simple. Think of one area in your life in which you would like to have stronger boundaries. And once you start there, start something simple, you'll get the hang of it and then you'll be better at it. So listen to your gut and listen to what you need. You know what we need, and sometimes we just need that time to figure it out. Pay attention to what you need and what makes you feel uncomfortable or guilty. Guilt can be an identifier that we aren't doing enough for our families or employers. So it can be helpful identifying that we are being pushed beyond what we can handle in that moment. If you think about the values that you have in your life, if you have strong family values, set boundaries around working late when you can. If you're feeling overwhelmed with work, set a boundary about not taking on other projects. I often will jump to helping people when I know that I can't take on another project. And I did that a few weeks ago, and it felt really good to be like, this, I already have too much on my plate. I can't take anything else on at the moment. And I knew that if I were to take on that project, then I wouldn't do it to the best of my ability. So what to say? Be honest. Open communication is an incredibly important part of this. So plan ahead. Boundaries may change depending on the situation and the different people we are with. We may have more firmer boundaries with one person than another person. And that might have more loose boundaries when it comes to different situations. And be confident in yourself and trust that you deserve this. Make eye contact with the person that you're trying to have a boundary with. Be respectful. Phrase your boundaries with I statements. I need some time to myself when I get back from work. I have to focus on whatever task that you're trying to complete this weekend, so I can only hang out for a few hours. And just like with any other skill that we are trying to build within ourselves, practice. We need to practice. The more you practice, the more you share those words with yourself, like I need to take care of myself. It will feel easier and more relaxed when you say it to someone else. But expect that it might feel uncomfortable in the beginning. Letting someone know that you can't do something because of something is hard. And we don't want to disappoint people. We don't want to make people feel bad. But sometimes that is exactly what we need to do for ourselves, is just to say, I can't do this in that moment. Prioritize. Saying no is a part of realizing and actualizing your boundaries. You're not letting anyone down or disappointing anyone. You're still a good person, even if you can't help in that particular situation or with that particular project. We have to remember that some people might not respect our newly defined boundaries. Be firm with people if they don't respect that, if they start to beg or try to guilt you into reconsidering. You are more worthy and deserving of the right to take care of yourself and the right to say no. And if you feel that the boundaries that you set aren't working, examine them, evaluate them. Perhaps they're too strict, or maybe they're too lax. Maybe you need to be a little bit more strict. It could mean that there are other factors in that particular situation or relationship that need to be looked at or addressed. All right, we are going to take a moment. I'm going to put folks into groups, and we are going to have a discussion with folks in your group about boundary setting. It's not going to be too much. It's not going to be too stressful, just answering some simple questions with folks about setting boundaries. Because again, practice is a good thing, is good when you're trying to start something new. So we will there we go. We'll put folks in 3 to 4 participants per room, and we'll give about 10 minutes or so, and then we'll come back. So the 3 questions that we're going to focus on: who or where do you struggle setting boundaries? What can you do if there is pushback? What are some specific actions you can take to improve your boundaries? All right, and then we'll come back. And get back to the PowerPoint. All right. So we're going to do a little exercise, a little stretch break. And these are super important just things to do to shift our bodies, shift our emotions. It's easy when we're sitting for 8 hours to lose track of time, depending on what you're doing. So this, you could set an alarm on your clock, on your phone. You could just put a Post-it somewhere to remind yourself that every hour to just take a little, couple minutes or 2 and just do some stretches at your desk. To really get your body moving and to loosen those muscles, and do whatever your body needs in that moment. And there's this whole movement. When I was trying to add this slide, there's actual like articles and things that talk about desk yoga or yoga for your office. So if you're wanting to learn more information about this, there's a lot of information out there.
So we've taken a lot of time to talk about the importance of acknowledging our needs as people in these roles, but we would be doing all of you and ourselves a disservice to not take some very intentional time to also examine and acknowledge the history of self-care itself and where it comes from. So beginning there with the 1950s, self-care was first coined as a medical term of all things. It was a way for doctors to encourage patients to treat themselves, most often under the guidance of a health professional. This was especially true for patients who required long-term care and otherwise had very little autonomy. Later, academics began to look for ways for workers in more high-risk and emotionally daunting professions, such as trauma therapists, social workers, EMTs, and so on, to combat stress brought on specifically by their jobs. I think that sounds very familiar to all of us, certainly, but we'll put a pin in that and come back to it. With the rise of the women's and civil rights movement, self-care took on new significance and meaning. Self-care was community-centered and a direct response to the systems of oppression that Black folks were systematically subjected to. The Black Panther Party, Audre Lorde, and Angela Davis all spoke on the importance of the Black community creating spaces and resources for their own care and well-being because the constant violence and anti-Black systems that they were subjected to daily were so harmful and traumatizing to their community, again, on a daily basis. So it's important for us to recognize that self-care is an important act of nurturing our well-being in the face of trauma for all of us, and that we are all deserving of self-care. We have to be cognizant of the fact that it has been claimed and co-opted, right, by capitalists and white supremacist forces. Self-care has become a marketing ploy in many spaces, a means to justify checking out of systemic oppression. So what I mean by that is it can be very easy for those of us with identities that give us positions of privilege to sort of tune out to the realities of trauma and exhaustion that our fellow community members are experiencing in the name of self-care. Now, I want to be very clear that I'm not advocating that we subject ourselves to the nonstop 24-hour news cycle of violence and harm that is being committed across the world, right? That's not good for anyone, and that is not the solution here. But to entirely ignore the very real systems of oppression, particularly anti-Blackness, that is rampant every day here in the US, in the name of self-care, is a disservice to the people that we commit ourselves to serving and to being caring community members for. So what we want to do on this slide is just name the reality that for Black and Indigenous folks, for folks of color, for folks who are members of the LGBTQ community, who regularly experience systemic oppression that wears on their bodies and their well-being, that self-care is not just, right, this like daily little practice to check in with themselves, right? It has much deeper meaning and significance. We have to be cognizant of that and respectful of the fact that for these community members, the act of self-care is all the more important, right? Especially because of being subjected to that systemic oppression. Self-care in this act is radical, it is resistance, it is survival for these communities. So I just want to challenge us to be mindful of the fact that self-care, while always deeply personal for us all, its meaning and importance carries profound significance depending on our identities and lived experiences. And that isn't a history or a fact that we should ignore.
A part of that radicalness of self-care is similar to self-care, but called community care, which involves multiple people caring for one another. You can also kind of see it as mutual aid. It's that foundation of togetherness, and it is something that Angela Davis talks about. Community care is a radical act. As Sarah mentioned, it recognizes that, sorry, my cat is self-caring me right now. It recognizes that we don't all have access to the same time, money, and resources. So finding people who are within your communities that you can rely on is a way of taking care of yourself. Invest in the people around you, whether that is your friends, your neighbors, your colleague, your family. And it can be on a micro level and macro level. So community care could be offering to babysit or having someone within your community care circles babysit for you, cooking a meal for someone, or having someone cook a meal for you. Just regular check-ins with loved ones, and that can be anyone around you, not just your family. Creating that self-care kit for your friend, or doing it as a community care event or evening creating that emergency self-care kit. It can be on the macro levels of activism. Sometimes that recharges people's batteries, is participating in activism and practicing anti-racism and anti-oppression. That can be that more macro level of community care. Donating to organizations. Sometimes, again, we don't have the same access to time, but we do have access to resources. So donating to organizations who are taking care of folks or supporting folks, that can be that macro level of community care.
So returning to this idea of where self-care started and where it is today, we have to acknowledge that there are certain parts of our lives, or I should say our larger society, that have sort of gotten their hands on this concept and maybe shifted it, co-opted it, changed its meaning, its intention. And let's just take a minute to acknowledge that. So unfortunately, it's really common for self-care to be routinely packaged to us like it's something that we have to buy, like it's something that we need to spend money on for it to be true self-care. Now, I want to be really clear that I'm never going to suggest that you shouldn't spend money on yourself, right? By all means, whatever that looks like for you, whatever it is that is restorative to you, if that's going to a spa, if that's buying a beautiful sweater, splurging on 10 new books because it makes you genuinely feel good. You know that about yourself, Angie. I like the self-identifier. You know that about yourself, and that is different than feeling the need to constantly participate in a system that requires you to buy your troubles away, right? Something that is genuinely restorative to you is different than constantly participating in this exchange of money, which ultimately just contributes to a larger system of consumption and waste. And that is a cycle that unfortunately impacts communities across the world, right? Whenever I stop to think that 80% of textiles that are donated to places such as Goodwill end up in landfills, right? Our compulsion to buy away our problems does impact others. And so this is in no way a finger wag or an attempt to guilt or shame anyone out of spending their money on themselves, which you deserve to do. It is a plea for us all to stop and pause and think about what is actually restorative to me and what genuinely feels good versus what is the influence and pressure of the idea that caring for myself must involve spending money, right? And must involve consumption of some kind. I want to challenge us to see where we can step away from that cycle when possible, to reduce our consumption and to reduce our waste, because those do have impacts on other people in our direct communities and our larger global community. So, okay, great, Sarah. We know that we want to be mindful of how we're practicing self-care, why we need it, to be careful of the sort of actions that we're pursuing in the name of self-care. That's all great. So I recognize that I'm feeling burnt out. What am I supposed to do? Something that I'd like to really highlight is knowing your why. So that is reflecting on why it is that we need to care for ourselves in the first place, because the answer to that can really inform the steps that we take to replenish ourselves. For instance, if I notice that I'm feeling really angry and irritable and begin to recognize that I have some compassion fatigue, my first instinct might be, honestly, to grab my phone and doom scroll through Twitter or sort of numb out on Instagram Reels. That is definitely easy for me to do. Something to distract myself from whatever anger or irritation that I'm feeling. If I'm being really honest, though, that's not exactly helpful. Yes, it's a distraction, and distraction is a valid form of self-care and can be appropriate. But what I should really stop to do is ask myself, why am I doing this? Is it actually restoring the parts of myself that feel burnt out, that feel tapped out, and feel a little bit like they're running on empty? Without turning to my why, I'm a lot more likely to lean on coping mechanisms that help me to maybe get through the moment, but might only be a temporary fix, right? The compassion fatigue that I was experiencing earlier isn't actually gone. I've just momentarily displaced it. So I have to take the time to pause and think about the why. Why do I need to restore myself in the first place? which brings us to the idea of being proactive about our self-care. The truth is that caring for ourselves isn't always really flashy or fun. It can really include the most basic, simple steps to feel human every single day. So never has this been, for me, more apparent than during the pandemic. In the early days, I was still finishing my master's degree. What I mean is in the early days of the pandemic. And it was very easy during that time at home to let all semblances of routine vanish and to just sort of live in my sweatpants, like roll out of bed, roll into the couch, back and forth, right? And any sort of structure that had existed in my day prior just sort of disappeared. And while at first that was really nice to sort of just luxuriate in the slowness of life, the truth is that some of those basic routines and some of those basic steps that I was taking every day were a lot more important than I gave them credit for to just feeling human and feeling present. So in some ways, right, that had to change and be adjusted. For instance, maybe I was always putting on makeup every day because I felt pressure to present a certain face at school or at work, right? Pressure to be pretty, especially as a cis woman, right? That's just a pressure that a lot of us are constantly being faced with. But maybe instead of putting makeup on for that reason, right, it was just making sure I had moisturizer on my face, or making sure that I was taking steps to at least care for myself. In many ways, staying home was so illuminating how much of my routine was built around the need to perform for others. But like I said, when I stopped after a while to recognize which of those steps were actually for me, it was a good reminder of what are the proactive things I can do to feel human. Like I said, that isn't always necessarily really flashy and fun. So I've been trying to find the middle ground, right? What does it mean to have a routine for me, no, not for others, that helps me to feel my best? Is it always wearing sweats and staying planted on my couch for days in a row, right? Or is it being mindful of how I'm online shopping, being mindful of how I'm participating in harmful systems like capitalism or patriarchy? I had the opportunity to stop and think about what are the proactive basic things that I can do for myself to feel human. That isn't always flashy and fun. Like I said, sometimes it's that really basic stuff of I washed my face, I got dressed, I sat at the desk instead of on my couch. Things like that, that proactively, routinely help me to feel present, to feel in my body, and to feel like I can do my day. I don't just feel amorphous, nor do I feel the exhaustion of performing for others. It's finding that middle ground.
So we're talking about reactionary versus proactive, and thinking about when does it just become too much? When is thinking about self-care, knowing that it's not going to help, how do you identify that? And I think therapy is something that we can think about, and it's something that I think everyone could benefit from and needs at some point, but we have to recognize that it's still so inaccessible for a lot of people. And so how or when do we determine when it's appropriate to seek therapy? We're all so incredibly overwhelmed. There's this thing happening today, and then later today there might be something else happening. Tomorrow there's something happening way across the world that affects us here. Like there's just so much going on. And we may just need someone who isn't our family member, who isn't a friend, who isn't a colleague, to help us get through it. We need to recognize that they're also going through things as well in their lives. And they might not be that best person to work through some of the things that we're going through. There used to be so much stigma around even just saying, I need a therapist. So identifying that you need a therapist and then finding a therapist, there's so much stigma around it. And I think that's better today. But I think sometimes the internal residual shame that's within us hasn't gone away. And while I think that shame, I don't want to normalize it, but just name it and recognize it is super important. I hope that at least some of us or all of us today here can shove those feelings of shame aside and literally say, this is too much for me. I need help. Finding a therapist is an art form. It takes time and it takes patience. And it's really difficult when we're in that moment of crisis to have not the patience, I don't think that's the right word, but the ability to allow that time to pass. I started to see a therapist last year, and halfway through the 10 sessions that insurance had paid for, I realized she's not the right fit for me. And I think finding a therapist that fits our needs and our personality is like really finding a good pair of shoes. You may have to try on a few until we find the one that fits us the most. And don't be ashamed or guilty if you have to break up with your therapist and find a different one. I think if they don't understand that, they're in their own profession, and they should understand it because they're a therapist. They know they're not going to click with every single person. Sarah and I also talked about some scams or shams that might be around in the world because a lot of our lives are lived online today. And while there may be good platforms out there to use, there may be some that take advantage of those who don't have access to insurance that pays for mental health care. So take your time. Do your research if you can, and do your internet sleuthing and look at reviews online. Check them out, get reviews, or not reviews, but referrals from other people. And for a lot of therapists nowadays do free 15-minute consultations. And yes, I know 15 minutes isn't a lot of time to figure out if that person is going to fit you or not. But use that time, utilize their free 15 minutes to interview them, because they are going to be the ones that you're going to share a lot of really deep and personal things with that you may never tell anyone in your life. So use that time. And if they don't advertise it, ask. The worst they'll say is no, right? But the bottom line is you're worth it. You are worth recognizing that what I'm going through and what I'm feeling may be too much for self-care in that moment, and I just need to see a therapist. So another resource from Trauma Stewardship. She has several great free resources that we linked to at that end of this presentation. But this is another look at what we can utilize in our lives to figure out, this is what I need right now in that moment. So this could be an amazing thing to add to your self-care kit, your emergency self-care kit. And it might not be, I feel like this is different than a lot of the self-care examples that are out there in the world, as it gives it a little bit more personalized experience about how you can, in every moment of your day, navigate through finding little moments to take care of yourself.
So now that we've taken some time to think about what does it mean to establish a basic proactive routine for myself that helps me to feel human, that will help offset fatigue or burnout, that I can return to sustainably and regularly, let's take a moment to do a check-in and reflect on, have you ever thought about self-care in that proactive way, not just the reactive, oh my gosh, things are on fire and I need something immediately, right? What sorts of things do you like to do to be proactive for your well-being? So we'll be returning to Padlet. Again, if you already submitted an answer, feel free to submit another one if you've been thinking and wanted to share more. And we'll take 2 minutes for people to enter their answers and then a few minutes to process together. Okay. So I've had a chance to look through some of the things, some of the answers that have been submitted, and I see more you are typing. Please go ahead and continue to submit your responses. And I'm super excited to see that lots of folks are thinking about self-care on a regular basis or have already carved out regular activities that they know are good for them, nurture them, and hopefully, right, help prevent the onset of that fatigue, of that stress, and of that trauma response. I love some of the answers that I really like to highlight. Consistent conversations with like-minded people helps me to focus on self-care in a proactive way. People who will listen and help hold me accountable. Love that. Love a great support network. Exercise, talk therapy, meditation. Love that. A lot of people talking about going for walks, either with themselves or with their animals. I could not agree more. A simple walk can be so amazing for just a simple reset. I really love this one. One thing that I love to do is take myself out on a date. I will go out to eat, go for a walk, see a movie, etc. by myself. I love ending my day with doing something I love as well as such as painting, reading, or writing music. That is absolutely fantastic. Weightlifting, watching a sad movie for a way to release my emotions. Yes, for me, sometimes it's just listening to some of my favorite quote unquote sad music. I feel sort of bad labeling it as sad music because I don't think the musicians were necessarily trying to make it that way. But that release feels so good and is such a healthy way to get it out. Journaling, going to the gym, trying to eat healthy, staying away from negative people, having outlets in the field to talk to. Yes. Unplugging from my phone. Oh my gosh, yes. The do not disturb. You can also put timers on some of your apps or on your phone in general. Granted, it's really easy to bypass those timers if you are determined enough, but those little boundaries with yourself, I think, are such a great idea. Oh, someone mentioned PTO days. Yes, take your PTO. It is there for you. This is great. I'm really glad to see that so many people recognize that how they are spending their day-to-day hours when they're not at work really matters for their own well-being, right? And that the way that we care for ourselves and nurture our well-being doesn't just have to be in response to an explosive event that has completely wiped us out, right? We can also take steps to release and debrief the daily emotions that we experience, as well as to restore ourselves in simple ways. I love these answers because they really illustrate that not everything has to be about spending a ton of money or doing something huge and flashy to take care of ourselves, which can be fun. And I'm not saying that you're not allowed to do that, but being mindful of what are the daily, simple, proactive things that we can do to feel human and to care for ourselves. That's awesome. Okay. So returning to this idea of the signs burnout, the signs of that stress, we've talked a lot about secondary trauma exposure. Another term that I'm sure many of you have come across is vicarious trauma. So whether you're working directly with survivors, other community members, whether you're doing prevention education in this field, you are likely to run into vicarious traumas. And an easy way to spot the signs that we have been subjected to that, experiencing a response to it, is to remember the vicarious trauma ABCs. So that first one being awareness. So that is being attuned to our own needs, our limits, our boundaries, our emotions, resources, and practicing self-acceptance for all of those things. What do I have emotional bandwidth for today? Where do I not have emotional bandwidth? What do I need to do this successfully, to show up today and to get things done? Is that rest? Is that a break? Is that help, right? Do I have the bandwidth to get this done? That awareness is really crucial. Balance is the B in the ABCs, right? So maintaining a work-life balance. So focusing on work when you're there, but then really allowing yourself to play, to have rest, to take restorative time for yourself when you're away from work. That last one being connection. So maintaining supportive relationships and practicing communication. I have talked about this a few times, but one of my best girlfriends and I at one point worked at the same agency together and lived together. And we had to instate a rule very quickly that when we were home, we weren't going to talk about work together. Because while it was really wonderful to have someone else right there at my fingertips at all times who understood what was happening in the workplace day in and day out, it also meant that we were not giving ourselves an emotional or mental break from that vicarious trauma. We were bringing it home with us and then just sort of stewing in it. Now, that doesn't mean that you can't have someone to lean on to debrief with, but you have to be able to recognize the distinction. And so we made that distinction and we drew that boundary. So we had each other as connection, but we also knew when maybe it was unhealthy to continue keeping work at the center of our minds and our hearts when we were away from the office, right? So that was that awareness, it was balance, it was connection, it was all three ABCs in action. Another one that I'm sure many of you are familiar with is practicing mindfulness. Want to just name that gets tossed around so frequently that I'm sure a lot of different ideas spring to mind right away when we hear it, and maybe some of it feels a little, I don't want to say nonsensical, but I've heard people say, right, that sometimes mindfulness feels like this hollow idea because it can mean so much, but I challenge us to recognize that that is maybe a good thing. Some people hear mindfulness and think that means that they have to become experts at meditation. And if that's true for you and you get a lot out of meditation, that's wonderful. But mindfulness is really just about being able to calmly acknowledge things that are happening around us while they are happening, right? Just being present in the moment. There are different ways to do that. It doesn't just have to be meditation. That can just be approaching everyday things with curiosity, being forgiving of ourselves and of others for our humanness, for making mistakes, practicing compassion, consciously and intentionally really nurturing our connections with others, accepting again that things will come and they will go, and just embracing the imperfection of our lives, right? Embracing vulnerability, embracing imperfection, and just trying to be present in each moment with ourselves and with others.
Self-care, a part of our daily routine, is incredibly important. It doesn't have to be daily, it could be weekly, just whenever you need that little boost, that little oomph, you need to build it. So think about how you're coping right now. Think about what might need to change. What do you need to add or remove? That could be a part of your life, but also self-care, figuring out what works for you and what doesn't work for you. So choose activities that are realistic and will fit into your life. Obviously, if you want to do something that you don't have access to, that might not be something that you want to focus around setting a part of your self-care routine. Think about any barriers that might be preventing you from incorporating self-care into your life. And if you can remove them, if you can't, try to work around them and making it meaningful. If it is meaningful for us, if it is something that we are passionate or have passion for, we are going to look forward to incorporating that into our lives. We talked about community care and that connection, a part of the ABCs. Make it a group effort. Make it fun. It's a bonding activity. We're sharing our joys with one another. There's nothing that I really like more in my life, and that's hyperbolic, of course, but talking to someone about something that I love, whether that is a book or music. When we share the things that make us happy, we then get that dopamine and serotonin. It's really amazing. Commitment. We want to commit to whatever we're doing, which is why we want to make sure that it is something that's realistic, that it'll fit into your life, that it's something that you can do with others. That means you are, for me, it means I'm more likely to commit to it. So thinking about what you're enjoying, what you have passion for, and committing to making it a part of your life in whatever frequency makes sense for you. So there are a ton of resources out there. You can also make one for yourself. And so we wanted to include some ideas for you. So using the trauma stewardship resources, using Google Images is a great way to finding That's how we found these. It's a great way of finding a plan that you can utilize to identify what I might need in any specific moment. I really love this wheel because when we think about all of the ways that secondary trauma, overwhelming feelings, burnout, compassion fatigue show up in our life, using something like this that really looks at all of the aspects of our life and gives us examples as to how we can nurture that part is incredibly important. Our personal life affects our physical bodies. Our connection to whatever we feel is a part of our spiritualness can affect our emotions and our mood. So all of these things interact with one another in a way that we want to find balance if we can with all of them. And you can find a blank version of this wheel on the internet, but you can also just, so on a Word document or like a piece of paper, just jot all of the ways that would fit within your life of incorporating some of these examples or creating your own examples for that matter.
When you are making your self-care plans or using one of those tools, I think it's important to be mindful that doing this can be hard and it's not always fun, right? That image there, starting is the hardest part, could not be more true for something such as practicing regular self-care. I know for myself, at the end of a long day sitting at my desk, I'm sure that for some people, the first thing they want to do is stand up and stretch and maybe run around, jump around, get their body moving. But I know for me, I feel tired after sitting for so long, and I'm not sure that I necessarily have the energy to get up and move around. And so the thing that I need to do for myself isn't always necessarily what I want to do. And that's what we mean when we say that self-care can be hard. What we need and what we want doesn't always align, but that doesn't mean that we should ignore the very real basic things that our body, our minds, and our heart require to be well, to show up and to do this job presently and mindfully. So getting started, right, is that hardest part. But if you can be honest with yourself and pinpoint what you really need, get yourself started gently and just take it from there. It doesn't have to be perfect. Just get started. That's the hardest part. So we have alluded to this at several points throughout today's workshop, but we want to make sure that we take some time to really carve it out and name it. That when it comes to self-care, oftentimes some of the biggest barriers that we're facing are external and aren't necessarily our own challenges, right, at achieving or taking on a task that will help restore. Sometimes it is external things that we have very little control over, and a big part of that can be workplace culture. We wanted to send an encouraging message to you all of what can you do with your teammates, what can you do with coworkers to create a culture in which your well-being as a team in this line of work is always at the center. A part of that is just nurturing a positive team spirit, having each other's backs, believing in the good of your fellow team members, believing in your ability to do good work together, giving folks the benefit of the doubt, right? Cultivating that positive, supportive team network can really go so far. Regularly celebrating and appreciating one another. So vocalize your gratitude, your appreciation for each other's work, for each other's compassion, for something funny they did that had nothing to do with work, but maybe it made you laugh and really brightened up your day. Don't be afraid to vocalize those things or to practice active gratitude for each other. Sharing your workload, delegating when you can, using each other for support as a network when things get really tough, finding a way to laugh with one another, seeing the big picture when you can. I know that on the really hard days, it can be far too easy to feel so overwhelmed with the fact that the structures that perpetuate violence are a lot bigger than anything that one agency can tackle by itself, right? We are up against much larger systems and structures than any one of us by ourselves can really take on. But if we see the big picture, that we are doing something to challenge the violence and and the culture that tolerates violence, that we are doing something meaningful to help our community, to help our survivors. Keeping that big picture can help keep us grounded in the work and to not get too overwhelmed by the very hard realities about this work. And the last one there with organizational culture, we talked about this a bit in the beginning. If you are in a leadership role, that means not just telling your team members to do as you say, but not as you do, right? That means walking the walk and talking the talk. That means encouraging and nurturing your team members to take time for themselves, to ask for help, to have boundaries, to practice good work-life balance, and not just telling them to, but practicing it yourself so that they can see it in your own actions. So they know with confidence and with certainty that when they ask for time off or when they need to reach out for help in their role, they've seen it happen somewhere else in the agency and they aren't afraid to reach out for that support themselves, right? Because it's been normalized and it's honored and recognized as a need within your agency. So really being mindful that if you have that leadership position, you can have profound and meaningful impact on that workplace culture and making it one that genuinely centers self-care. Doesn't just say it, but genuinely does it.
So if this is like a summary slide of everything that we hope that you have gained from our time together. Be proactive, start before you need it. Again, because in that moment of overwhelm or just feelings of it's really difficult to start something. So be proactive, identify what you need before you need it. Make it a part of your daily routine, weekly routine, however frequent, again, you need it. Find what works for you. Make sure that it's something that you enjoy, that you have passion for. Do it as a group. Make it a group community effort and ask for help. We are worthy of doing all of those things. And it doesn't make us less of a person if we say, I'm at my limit, I need some help. Here are some resources that we used to create this presentation. Again, trauma stewardship, we can't recommend that enough. That is really great. And there are some free downloads that you can get from that book, the work that Dr. Laura is doing. Self-care and trauma work, it recognizes that we are working in a field that is incredibly difficult. And self-care is absolutely essential in making sure that we're able to not only do our jobs, but just be humans. Again, things you should know: that you're worthy, your feelings are valid, you are enough, you are loved, and you absolutely add value to this world. So thank you so much for spending your time with us, for giving of your energy that you might not have had. And hopefully that this gave you a little bit of energy to help for the rest of the day and your week. And I know I don't want to speak for Sarah, but we at WCASA are here for you. That is our role. That's the reason that we exist, that we are funded, is to support you in your work. So if you ever need any support, whether that is individually in your role or as your organization as a whole, please do not hesitate to absolutely reach out. Sarah and my contact information is listed there. So if you are unsure of whether or not we can support you, just reach out to us. And if we are not the best contacts, we will pass it along to other staff at WCASA. But we are here to support you in the work that you are doing. So please do not hesitate to reach out.
With that, we thank you for your time and your attention and your presence today. Feel free to hop off. Take these next 10 minutes before the hour to do nothing, right? Like step away from your computer. If you'd like to stay on and ask any questions, Angie and I will stick around, but otherwise, please take care of yourselves and we look forward to seeing you again in the future. Bye all.